of rehabilitation and just become punishment warehouses? Are there states moving to change this? Andrew?
Prisons have never been very good at rehabilitation. They've always been good at retribution, the first R, which is punishment. I'm not sure about states moving towards this. Other countries have done a very good job of this in Europe, of focusing equally on the other R's, so rehabilitation as opposed to retribution. But I get asked this question a lot. Andrew, how do we do this better? First of all, this is not something that as state attorney we have direct power over because it's done through the Department of Corrections. But my answer, because that answer is not satisfactory, of course, is that we need to spend more money on education. And I don't mean in prison, I mean generally. And here's the reason why. Because as common sense as it may be, that we need to invest in rehabilitation to help inmates transition back to society, because most of them are coming back into our community. It is very difficult politically and perhaps morally to justify spending money to educate and train people for jobs who have committed crimes when we don't have sufficient money to educate and train people for jobs who haven't committed crimes. And the solution is not to say we're not going to train the people in prison. The solution is to make sure we have adequate funding to train and educate people who haven't committed crimes. Therefore, we can't have that argument held against us anymore, and then we can start using additional funds to train people in prisons so that they can re-enter society peacefully and successfully.
Just to add to that, thanks. We need to change how we think and talk about this. When we are when new bills are introduced, new laws are introduced to reform transfer to adult courts, there's often a huge pushback. Well, it's going to cost so much money because it's cheaper to incarcerate a kid in an adult prison. It's still expensive, but it's cheaper than it is to house them with DJJ, because in a juvenile facility they have to be provided with services. But that's not necessarily the case, not the same sorts of services in an adult facility. But why are we complaining that we have to spend money on our kids? And so, we should obviously be paying for education at the outset, but when they are in detention facilities, we should also be providing them with services then. I think we just need to shift the way that we talk about it and frame it instead of changing what provisions are in our bill, saying, well, it costs too much, so let's not affect as many people, or let's not push as hard for reform. We should want to spend money on kids to make sure that they are rehabilitated and do re-enter our society successfully.
If I could add one other point, we have a particular impediment in Florida, regardless of whether it's an adult or a juvenile who is sentenced as an adult. Back in the 80s, we, the people, approved a constitutional amendment called STOP, S-T-O-P, Stop Turning Out Prisoners, which says anyone sentenced to a state prison sentence must serve a minimum of 85% of that time. In addition, the legislature has created a number of crimes. They've moved and changed misdemeanors and increased them to felonies in a number of instances. They've also adopted a number of mandatory minimum sentencing requirements that require 100% service of time for that mandatory minimum. So there are some statutory and constitutional restrictions in Florida that are particularly problematic for any reform in this area.
Andrew, you mentioned it earlier, restorative justice. In the one case that I worked where my client was released, we arranged for him, he was still in prison, to meet the victim's wife. He had been involved in an armed robbery that turned deadly. He was not the shooter, but he was involved in the robbery of a business. There had been 4 people involved. He, from the very beginning, testified against the other 3 co-defendants. They were all convicted. 2 got death, 1 got life. But this restorative justice, when we were struggling with a way to try to figure out how to help this man who had gone 26 years in prison without ever getting one disciplinary report, I suggested to the prosecutor, and she was willing to work with me, to have my client and the victim's wife meet. He had things he wanted to say to her, he wanted to apologize. He had gone through some victims advocacy counseling in prison, and he wanted to apologize to her in person. So we arranged it at the state attorney's office. Her sister was with her, and before he could apologize, she stopped him and said, "I forgave you a long time ago." And he could barely get his apology out. He was so taken aback that she had already forgiven him. He didn't know what to say, and he kind of stumbled through it, but then he answered questions that she had about what had happened, how things had gone on. She was a little bit confused about some of the facts. He was able to answer questions for her, and she told her sister, who testified at his hearing, that she said that night it was the best night's sleep. She had finally had some peace. She got to meet him. She had a chance to talk to him, to see how apologetic he was and how sorry for whatever actions he had taken. It was quite a moving experience, and I wish we could do more of that. This was unusual, but I think oftentimes in simple little cases, say a young man stole a car, if he was able to maybe sit down with the owner of the car and they could get to know each other. I know that would be time consuming, not necessarily money, but I don't think we do enough of that.
Kelly, when you talk about wishing we could do more of that, is it not allowed, or is it just simply time?
It's generally time. It's not done much. I mean, occasionally it is done, but oftentimes it's not. And
It would take a prosecutor and someone like yourself working together
Right.
to make that happen.
On that point, does everyone understand what restorative justice is, the concept? Okay, so very brief background. Our system, and this is the real impediment in addition to the things that Kelly identified, our system is one of retributive justice. We basically punish people when they've committed a crime. And there are other goals, rehabilitation and restitution and preventing recidivism. But the main thing we do is when someone commits a crime, they're held accountable by being incarcerated or having sanctions. Restorative justice is the idea that the goal is to make the person whole again, and usually the victim whole, or the community whole. So it's the idea that if somebody commits a crime, rather than putting them into a system where, one, they don't take responsibility, they don't take accountability for it, and they're just locked up often, you actually make them take accountability and responsibility for it. It's done through putting someone in a sit-down with a victim, by paying restitution, by performing community service, something to wrong the right that they've committed. And they're all, right the wrong, thank you. We don't want to wrong the right. We didn't get that on video, did we? To right, yeah, I'm sure. To right the wrong that's been committed. So there are programs like this that have sprouted up across the country over the last decade. They're underutilized in large part just because that's not the criminal justice system we've had for 250 years.
Are there